The rifle trembled in Captain Elena Vasquez's hands as she stared down at the wounded enemy soldier crumpled against the bombed-out wall of the abandoned school. Blood seeped through his torn uniform, painting dark stains across the rubble-strewn floor. His eyes pale blue and filled with a desperate plea met hers through the smoke and dust of the Syrian battlefield. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Please, he whispered in accented English, his voice barely audible above the distant sound of artillery. I have information. Important information. Elena's finger hovered over the trigger. Protocol was clear. Eliminate all enemy combatants. No prisoners. No exceptions. The order had come directly from Colonel Morrison himself, delivered with the cold efficiency that had earned him his reputation as the Iron Hammer of the 3rd Infantry Division. But something in the young man's face stopped her. He couldn't be more than 22, barely older than her youngest brother back in Texas. A thin gold cross hung from a broken chain around his neck, catching the filtered sunlight streaming through the shattered windows. Captain. Sergeant. Rodriguez's voice cut through her hesitation. Enemy reinforcements, 2 clicks out and closing fast. We need to move now. The smart tactical decision was obvious. One squeeze of the trigger, and they could evacuate immediately. No complications, no questions. No court-martial for disobeying direct orders. Elena lowered her weapon. Rodriguez, help me get him to the extraction point. Ma'am, with all due respect, Colonel Morrison's orders were. I know what the orders were, Sergeant. Elena's voice carried the authority of someone who had climbed through the ranks on merit alone, earning her captain's bars in a man's army through sheer determination and tactical brilliance. But I'm making a command decision. This prisoner may have intelligence value. As they lifted the wounded soldier between them, Elena caught a glimpse of something in his jacket pocket, the corner of what looked like a map or document. Her instincts, honed through 3 tours of duty, told her this moment would change everything. She was right, though not in the way she expected. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, I want to take a moment to thank you for watching. Creating and narrating these detailed, novel-length stories takes tremendous time and research to bring you the most engaging content possible. We're embarking on a journey of nearly 50,000 words together. That's a full novella. If you're already hooked by what you've heard, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this story with someone who would enjoy it, and subscribing to the channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest stories. This is going to be an epic adventure, so get comfortable. And let's continue with this remarkable tale. The fluorescent lights in Colonel Morrison's office cast harsh shadows across his weathered face as Elena stood at attention. Her dress, uniform crisp despite the 18-hour flight from the combat zone. Behind the colonel's desk, the American flag hung motionless in the sterile air of Fort Braxton's administrative building, a stark contrast to the chaos she'd left behind in Syria just 48 hours earlier. Captain Vasquez, Morrison's voice carried the weight of 30 years in the military, each word measured and deliberate. Do you understand why you're here? Yes, sir. I'm facing charges for disobeying direct orders regarding prisoner protocols. In Theater of Operations 7 Alpha. Morrison leaned back in his leather chair, his steel gray eyes never leaving Elena's face. That's a remarkably clinical way of describing what amounts to treason, Captain. The word hit Elena like a physical blow, but she maintained her composure. Treason, the charge that could end not just her military career, but potentially her freedom for decades to come. She thought of her parents back in San Antonio, her father's proud tears when she'd graduated from West Point, her mother's daily prayers for her safety overseas. Sir, I acted on tactical intelligence assessment. The prisoner appeared to possess valuable information that could... The prisoner, Morrison interrupted, pulling a thick file from his desk drawer, was Dmitri Volkov, a known operative of the PSIA, Crimson Dawn terrorist network. A man responsible for the deaths of at least 47 American servicemen and women over the past 18 months. He slammed the file down on his desk. And you chose to spare his life based on what? A feeling? Elena's jaw tightened. Based on professional judgment, sir. He indicated he had intelligence regarding enemy operations. Intelligence that he never provided, Captain. Instead, he escaped from our detention facility 3 days after you brought him in. Escaped and returned to his terrorist cell, where he's undoubtedly sharing everything he learned about our operations during his brief captivity. The news hit Elena like ice water in her veins. Volkov had escaped? She'd been kept in isolation. Since her return, undergoing debriefing sessions that felt more like interrogations. No one had told her what happened to the prisoner she'd risked everything to save. Morrison stood and walked to the window overlooking the parade grounds, where fresh recruits were drilling in the North Carolina heat. 12 years ago, Captain. I had to write letters to the families of 6 Marines who died because their commanding officer showed mercy to the wrong person. 6 good soldiers who never made it home because someone decided the rules didn't apply to them. He turned back to face her, his expression carved from granite. I swore that day that I would never let sentiment override sound tactical judgment. In my command again. Your court-martial begins in 72 hours. Major Williams from JAG will represent you, though I suspect he'll recommend you plead guilty and hope for leniency. Sir, I request permission to dismissed Captain. Elena executed a perfect about-face and marched from the office, her mind racing. 72 hours to prepare a defense for the most important case of her life. 72 hours to prove that her moment of mercy hadn't been a catastrophic mistake. The bachelor officers' quarters at Fort Braxton hadn't changed much since Elena's first assignment there as a fresh second lieutenant 8 years earlier. The same institutional gray walls, the same narrow beds with military-issue blankets, the same sense of impermanent temporariness that defined military life. Elena sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the handful of personal items she'd been allowed to keep during her detention. A photo of her family at her West Point graduation, her father's Purple Heart from Vietnam, and a worn leather journal where she'd recorded her thoughts throughout 3 combat deployments. She opened the journal to the entry she'd written the night before the mission that had changed everything. Day 847 in theater. Intelligence suggests major enemy movement in Sector 7. Colonel Morrison briefed us on new protocols, no prisoners, no exceptions. I understand the tactical reasoning, but something feels different about this deployment. The civilian casualties are mounting, and I keep thinking about what we're really fighting for out here. Is it still about protecting American interests, or have we become something else entirely? A knock at her door interrupted her reading. Come in. Major Sarah Williams entered, carrying a briefcase and wearing the confident expression of someone who'd never lost a case she believed in. At 35, Williams had already earned a reputation as one of the military's most skilled defense attorneys, though her clients usually faced charges far less serious than treason. Captain Vasquez? I'm Major Williams, JAG Corps. I'll be representing you at your court-martial. Elena stood and shook her hand. Ma'am, I have to ask, do you believe you can win this case? Williams set her briefcase on the small desk and opened it, revealing stacks of legal documents and case files. That depends on several factors, Captain. First, I need to understand exactly what happened out there. The official report says you disobeyed direct orders to eliminate enemy combatants. Walk me through your decision-making process. Elena took a deep breath and began recounting the events of that day. She described the abandoned school, the wounded soldier, the document she'd glimpsed in his pocket. Williams listened without interruption, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. You mentioned a document, Williams said when Elena finished. Did you ever see what it contained? No, ma'am. He was taken directly to detention upon our return to base, and I was immediately placed under investigation. Williams frowned. That's unusual. Typically, any intelligence gathered from prisoners would be part of your file, either to support or undermine your case. She made another note. Captain, I'm going to be direct with you. The military justice system doesn't look favorably on officers who disobey direct orders, especially in combat situations. Colonel Morrison has built his case around the argument that your actions endangered your unit and violated fundamental military discipline. And what's our defense? That you acted on reasonable tactical assessment to preserve potentially valuable intelligence assets. Williams closed her notepad and looked directly at Elena. It's not a strong defense, given that the prisoner escaped before providing any useful information, but it's what we have. Elena felt the weight of her situation settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Major, can I ask you something off the record? Of course. Do you think I did the right thing? Williams was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. Captain, I've been practicing military law for 12 years. I've seen good officers make bad decisions under pressure, and I've seen bad officers make decisions that happen to work out well. What I've learned is that right and wrong aren't always clear-cut in combat situations. She paused, gathering her papers. But I will say this, the fact that you're asking that question tells me something about your character. Most officers facing treason charges are more concerned with saving their careers than examining their consciences. After Williams left, Elena returned to her journal, writing by the pale light filtering through the small window. Day 3 of detention. Court-martial in 69 hours. Major Williams seems competent, but I can tell she doesn't think we can win. Maybe we can't. Maybe I made the wrong call out there. But when I close my eyes, I still see that young man's face, still see the desperation in his eyes. Was it mercy or weakness that stayed my hand? Does it matter if the result is the same? Dad always said that the hardest decisions in life are the ones where both options feel wrong. Maybe that's what leadership really is, not making the right choice, but living with the consequences of the choice you make. The Fort Braxton Officers Club had seen better days. The carpet showed wear patterns from decades of military boots, and the wood paneling bore the scars of countless celebrations and commiserations. Elena sat alone at the bar, nursing a beer and trying to ignore the whispered conversations that stopped whenever other officers noticed her presence. Mind if I join you? Elena looked up to see Captain Marcus Chun, her former classmate from West Point and one of the few people who'd reached out since news of her court-martial had spread through the base. Marcus had always been the steady one in their class, the type of officer who followed regulations to the letter and never found himself in controversial situations. Sure, Marcus, though you might want to reconsider being seen with the accused traitor. Marcus ordered a beer and sat down beside her. Is that what you think you are? I don't know what I am anymore. Elena took a long sip from her bottle. 3 days ago, I was a decorated combat veteran with a sterling record. Now I'm facing charges that could put me in military prison for the next 20 years. Elena, I've known you for 12 years. Since our first day at the academy. You're a lot of things, stubborn, idealistic, sometimes too quick to trust your instincts over regulations, but you're not a traitor. The words hit deeper than Elena expected. Marcus had been there through some of the hardest moments of their military education, had seen her struggle with the balance between personal morality and military necessity that every officer faced. Tell me something, Marcus, honestly, if you'd been in my position that day, what would you have done? Marcus stared into his beer for a long moment. Honestly? I probably would have followed orders, eliminated the target and moved on. He looked at her directly. But that doesn't mean you were wrong to do something different, even if it ends my career, even if that prisoner turns out to be responsible for more American deaths. Even then, Marcus's voice carried a conviction that surprised Elena. Because the moment we stop questioning our orders, the moment we stop seeing the humanity in our enemies, we become something less than what we swore to protect. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the evening news on the television above the bar. The anchor was discussing the ongoing conflict in Syria, showing footage of the very region where Elena had made her fateful decision just days earlier. "There's something else," Marcus said quietly. "Something you should know before your court-martial." Elena tensed. "What?" "There's been talk among some of the junior officers about the prisoner protocols Colonel Morrison implemented. Not everyone is comfortable with the no prisoners policy. Marcus, if you're thinking about testifying on my behalf, I'm not talking about testimony. I'm talking about the fact that you might not be as alone in this as you think." He finished his beer and stood up. "There are people who believe you did the right thing. Elena, don't forget that when you're sitting in that courtroom." After Marcus left, Elena remained at the bar, lost in thought. The television had moved on to other stories, a political scandal in Washington, a natural disaster in the Pacific, but her mind kept returning to that moment in the abandoned school. The weight of the rifle in her hands, the look in Dmitri Volkov's eyes, the split-second decision that had changed the trajectory of her entire life. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her mother. "Mia, your father and I are praying for you. Whatever happens, we're proud of the woman you've become. Love, Mama." Elena felt tears threaten for the first time since her return from Syria. Her parents had sacrificed so much to give her the opportunities that led to West Point, to her commission, to the career that now hung in the balance. Her father, a Vietnam veteran who'd worked 2 jobs to put her through prep school, had never missed one of her graduations or promotions. The thought of facing them if she was convicted, of seeing the disappointment in their eyes, was almost unbearable. But worse than that was the growing certainty that she would make the same choice again. Given the same circumstances, the same moment of decision, she would still choose mercy over orders. And that realization terrified her more than any court-martial ever could. The legal research room in the JAG building was a testament to military efficiency. Rows of identical desks, fluorescent lighting that never seemed quite bright enough, and shelves lined with volumes of military law that represented decades of precedent and procedure. Elena had been given access to assist with her defense preparation, though she suspected it was more to keep her occupied than because her input would be particularly valuable. Major Williams sat across from her, surrounded by case files and legal briefs, her expression growing more concerned as she read through the prosecution's evidence. "Captain, I need to prepare you for what we're facing," Williams said, removing her reading glasses and rubbing her tired eyes. "The prosecution has built an extremely strong case. They have testimony from every member of your unit confirming that you received and acknowledged the no prisoners order. They have satellite footage showing you had clear shots at the target, but chose not to fire. And they have documentation showing that the prisoner you spared subsequently escaped and returned to active terrorist operations." Elena felt her stomach tighten. What about the potential intelligence value? Surely that counts for something. It would, if there was any evidence that the prisoner actually possessed valuable intelligence. But since he escaped before providing any information, we can't prove your assessment was correct. Williams opened another file. "There's something else. The prosecution is arguing that your decision to spare Volkov directly led to the death of Staff Sergeant Jennifer Morrison, Colonel Morrison's daughter, who was killed in a terrorist attack 3 weeks after Volkov's escape." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Morrison's daughter. She'd heard about the attack, a roadside bomb that had claimed the lives of 3 soldiers, but she hadn't known one of them was the colonel's child. "Jesus," Elena whispered. "No wonder he wants my head. It gets worse." The prosecution has evidence suggesting that Volkov was involved in planning that attack. Intelligence intercepts show communications between him and other Crimson Dawn operatives in the days before the bombing. Elena slumped in her chair, the full weight of her situation finally becoming clear. She hadn't just disobeyed orders. Her decision to show mercy had potentially contributed to the death of an American soldier, the daughter of her commanding officer. Major, given this evidence, what are my realistic chances? Williams was quiet for a long moment, organizing her papers with the methodical precision of someone buying time to find the right words. Captain, I believe in the military justice system. I believe that every accused service member deserves a vigorous defense. But I also believe in being honest with my clients. She met Elena's eyes directly. Your chances of acquittal are virtually non-existent. The best we can hope for is mitigation, arguing for a lesser sentence based on your previously exemplary record and the stress of combat conditions. Elena felt the walls of the small room closing in around her. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd sacrificed, was about to be destroyed by a single moment of compassion. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd joined the military to protect people, and her attempt to protect one person was going to end her ability to protect anyone ever again. There is one other option, Williams said carefully. The prosecution has indicated they might be willing to accept a plea bargain. You could plead guilty to the lesser charge of disobeying orders in combat conditions. It would mean a dishonorable discharge and probably 3 to 5 years in military prison, but it would avoid the treason conviction. And if I refuse the plea? Then we go to trial, present our case, and hope for a miracle. But Captain, I have to advise you that the evidence against you is overwhelming. A treason conviction could mean 25 years to life in military prison. Elena stared at the legal documents scattered across the table, each page representing another piece of evidence that would be used to destroy her life. She thought of her parents, of Marcus's words about not being alone, of the young soldiers who looked up to her as a leader and role model. I need time to think, of course. But I need your decision by tomorrow morning. The court-martial begins in 36 hours. That evening, Elena walked the perimeter of Fort Braxton, following the fence line that separated the military installation from the civilian world beyond. The North Carolina countryside stretched out in rolling hills covered with pine forests, a peaceful landscape that seemed disconnected from the chaos of her current situation. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed her brother's name. Hey, Diego. Elena. Mom told me what's happening. Are you okay? Diego was 2 years younger, but had always been her closest confidant. While she'd chosen the military, he'd become a teacher, dedicating his life to educating underprivileged kids in San Antonio. Different paths, but both rooted in the same desire to serve something greater than themselves. I'm managing, Elena said, not wanting to burden him with the full weight of her situation. Elena, don't lie to me. Mom and Dad are worried sick, and frankly, so am I. The news is saying you're facing treason charges. Elena stopped walking and leaned against the fence, watching the sun set over the pine trees. Diego, can I ask you something? If you had to choose between following the rules and doing what you thought was right, which would you choose? That depends. Are we talking about following school district policy, or are we talking about life and death decisions? Life and death. Diego was quiet for a moment. Elena, do you remember when we were kids and that dog got hit by the car in front of our house? Dad wanted to call animal control, said it wasn't our responsibility. But you insisted on taking it to the vet, even though we didn't have money for the bills. Elena smiled despite herself. She'd forgotten about that incident. Shadow, that was his name. You spent your entire summer savings on surgery for a dog that wasn't even ours. Dad was furious. But you said that being able to help someone meant you had a responsibility to help them, even if it wasn't convenient or practical. Shadow lived for 6 more years. The family that adopted him sent us pictures every Christmas. My point is, Elena, you've always been the person who chooses compassion over convenience. It's gotten you in trouble before, and it might get you in trouble now. But it's also what makes you the person I'm proud to call my sister. After they hung up, Elena remained by the fence until the stars came out, thinking about Shadow in second chances and the weight of moral choices. Somewhere in Syria, Dmitri Volkov was probably planning more attacks against American forces. Jennifer Morrison was dead, and her father blamed Elena for that death. But in her heart, Elena knew she would make the same choice again. The question was whether she was prepared to face the consequences of being the kind of person who chose mercy over orders. The answer would determine not just her fate, but the kind of officer and the kind of person she was willing to be. We're deep into this incredible story now, and I hope you're as captivated as I am by these unfolding events. The amount of effort that goes into researching, writing, and narrating these novel-length stories is immense. We're talking about creating content equivalent to a published book. But it's worth it to bring you stories that truly engage and transport you to another world. If you're enjoying this journey so far, please take a second to like this video and share it with friends who appreciate great storytelling. Your support means everything and helps us continue creating these detailed, epic narratives. We still have so much more to discover together. So let's see how this situation unfolds. The courtroom at Fort Braxton had been configured for the most significant court-martial in the base's recent history. The military's version of justice was on full display: austere wooden benches, the stark authority of military law represented by flags and insignia, and the weight of tradition that had governed military discipline for centuries. Elena entered, wearing her dress blues, every ribbon and decoration a reminder of the career that hung in the balance. She'd made her decision about the plea bargain during a sleepless night. She would fight the charges. If she was going down, she would go down maintaining her innocence and the righteousness of her actions. Major Williams looked confident despite their conversation the previous day, though Elena suspected it was more for show than genuine optimism. Across the aisle, the prosecution team was led by Lieutenant Colonel Janet Harrison, a no-nonsense prosecutor known for her meticulous preparation and ruthless cross-examinations. The presiding judge was Colonel Robert Hayes, a fair man whose reputation for following military law to the letter was both reassuring and terrifying. In military justice, judicial discretion was limited and precedent was everything. The court-martial of Captain Elena Vasquez will come to order, Colonel Hayes announced. Captain Vasquez, you are charged with disobeying direct orders in a combat zone, conduct unbecoming an officer, and providing aid and comfort to the enemy. How do you plead? Elena stood, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. Not guilty on all charges, Your Honor. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating in its precision. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison laid out the case methodically. Elena had received clear, unambiguous orders regarding enemy combatants. She had acknowledged those orders. She had deliberately disobeyed them, and her disobedience had directly contributed to the death of an American service member. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, Harrison concluded, this case is about the fundamental principle that governs military effectiveness: discipline. Without discipline, without the absolute certainty that orders will be followed, military units cease to function. Captain Vasquez's decision to place her personal judgment above military discipline didn't just endanger her unit, it resulted in the death of Staff Sergeant Jennifer Morrison and potentially countless other American service members who will face the consequences of her actions. Major Williams's opening was more philosophical, focusing on the complexities of combat decision-making. and the importance of tactical flexibility. She argued that Elena's decision was based on professional assessment of intelligence opportunities, not personal sentiment. Captain Vasquez is a decorated combat veteran with 12 years of exemplary service, Williams told the court. She has made countless split-second decisions under fire, decisions that have saved American lives and advanced American interests. On the day in question, she made a tactical assessment based on her extensive experience and training. The fact that this assessment ultimately proved incorrect does not make her actions treasonous. The first witness was Sergeant Rodriguez, Elena's second-in-command during the mission. Elena watched her former subordinate's face as he was sworn. In looking for some sign of support or understanding, what she saw instead was the careful neutrality of a soldier who valued his career more than loyalty to a fallen comrade. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Harrison began, "please describe the events of November 15th, beginning with the mission briefing." Rodriguez's testimony was precise and damaging. He confirmed that Colonel Morrison had personally briefed the unit on the no prisoners protocol. He confirmed that Elena had acknowledged understanding the orders. And he confirmed that when faced with the wounded enemy soldier, Elena had explicitly chosen to disobey those orders. "Sergeant, in your opinion, did Captain Vasquez's decision endanger the unit?" "Yes, ma'am. We were in a hot zone with enemy reinforcements approaching. Every minute we spent dealing with the prisoner was a minute we weren't moving to safety." Williams's cross-examination focused on Elena's leadership record and Rodriguez's own acknowledgement that she had consistently made good tactical decisions throughout their deployment. But the damage was done. Her own subordinate had testified that her decision was dangerous and contrary to orders. The next witness was more damaging still. Dr. Amanda Foster, the military intelligence analyst who had debriefed Dmitri Volkov during his brief captivity. Dr. Foster was in her mid-40s, with the tired eyes of someone who had spent years extracting information from unwilling subjects. "Dr. Foster," Harrison continued, "please describe your interactions with the prisoner Dmitri Volkov." "I conducted 3 interrogation sessions with Mr. Volkov over the course of 2 days. He was uncooperative and provided no useful intelligence regarding enemy operations, locations, or personnel." "Did he ever mention possessing important information about enemy attack plans?" "No. In fact, when pressed about Captain Vasquez's claim that he had indicated possession of valuable intelligence, Mr. Volkov denied making any such statements." Elena felt her heart sink. Either Volkov was lying to protect himself, or she had misunderstood his desperate words in the heat of the moment. Either way, her justification for sparing his life was evaporating. "Dr. Foster, in your professional opinion, did Mr. Volkov pose a continuing threat to American forces?" "Absolutely. His psychological profile indicated a committed ideological extremist with specialized knowledge of American tactical procedures gained through extensive combat experience. Allowing him to return to his terrorist cell was, in my assessment, extremely dangerous." Williams's cross-examination tried to establish that 2 days was insufficient time to extract information from a trained operative, but Dr. Foster's experience and credentials made her testimony nearly unassailable. The prosecution's case continued with devastating efficiency. Colonel Morrison himself testified about the strategic importance of the no prisoners policy, the intelligence that had led to its implementation, and the tactical necessity of eliminating enemy combatants in contested zones. When Harrison asked about his daughter's death, the colonel's composure never wavered, but Elena could see the pain behind his professional mask. Staff Sergeant Morrison was killed by an improvised explosive device planted by members of the Crimson Dawn terrorist network. He testified. Intelligence intercepts confirmed that Dmitri Volkov participated in planning that attack using information he gathered during his brief captivity to identify vulnerable convoy routes. Elena felt the weight of every person in the courtroom staring at her. She had spared the life of a man who had then helped kill a young American soldier. The daughter of the commanding officer who had trusted her with leadership responsibilities. The prosecution rested their case after 2 days of testimony that painted Elena as a reckless officer whose misguided compassion had resulted in American deaths. Major Williams faced an uphill battle in presenting the defense case. Their first witness was Dr. James Patterson, a psychiatrist who specialized in combat stress and decision-making under pressure. Dr. Patterson explained the psychological factors that influenced split-second choices in combat situations, the way adrenaline and stress could affect judgment, and the difficulty of maintaining perfect adherence to orders in chaotic environments. Dr. Patterson, Williams asked, in your professional opinion, is it possible for a competent, well-trained officer to make a reasonable decision that later proves to have negative consequences? Absolutely. Combat decision-making involves incomplete information, time pressure, and life or death stakes. Even the best officers sometimes make choices that, with the benefit of hindsight, appear to have been mistakes. Harrison's cross-examination demolished the defense of combat stress. She established that Elena had been thinking clearly enough to make a deliberate choice, that she had understood the order she was disobeying, and that she had consciously decided to prioritize her personal judgment over military discipline. Defense's character witnesses were more effective. Marcus Chen testified about Elena's leadership qualities and tactical acumen. Her former commanding officer from her second deployment, Colonel Sarah Matthews, spoke about her courage and commitment to protecting American lives. A chaplain discussed her moral character and dedication to service, but character witnesses couldn't overcome the fundamental facts of the case. Elena had disobeyed direct orders, and those orders existed for sound tactical reasons. On the third day of the court-martial, Elena herself took the stand. Williams had debated whether to put her client on the stand, knowing that Harrison's cross-examination would be brutal. But Elena had insisted on testifying on her own behalf. Captain Vasquez. Williams began, please describe your thought process when you encountered the wounded enemy soldier. Elena had rehearsed this moment, but sitting in the witness chair with the weight of military justice bearing down on her, the words came from her heart rather than her preparation. I saw a wounded human being who appeared to possess information that could save American lives. In that moment, I made a tactical assessment that the potential intelligence value outweighed the immediate tactical advantage of eliminating the target. Did you deliberately choose to disobey orders? I chose to exercise tactical discretion based on the unique circumstances of the situation. Every combat leader faces moments where strict adherence to orders may not serve the broader mission. Objectives. Williams led Elena through her military record, her combat experience, her dedication to protecting American service members. Elena testified about her decision-making process, her assessment of the prisoner's potential value, and her belief that she was acting in the best interests of the mission. Then came Harrison's cross-examination. Captain Vasquez, you've testified that you made a tactical assessment. But isn't it true that you had no intelligence training that would qualify you to assess a prisoner's potential value? I had field experience in identifying potential intelligence assets, ma'am. Field experience that told you a wounded terrorist pleading for his life was likely to provide valuable information. Elena felt the trap closing. Ma'am, I made the best decision I could with the information available at the time. The information available to you included direct orders from your commanding officer not to take prisoners. You chose to ignore those orders based on your personal assessment of a situation. Isn't that correct? Yes, ma'am. And your personal assessment proved to be completely wrong, didn't it? Mr. Volkov provided no useful intelligence and subsequently participated in attacks that killed American service members. Elena felt the weight of Jennifer Morrison's death settling on her shoulders. Yes, ma'am. The outcome was not what I had hoped. Captain Vasquez, Do you believe you're above military discipline? Do you believe your personal judgment supersedes direct orders from superior officers? No, ma'am. But I believe officers have a responsibility to exercise tactical discretion when circumstances warrant it, even when that discretion results in the death of American service members. Elena's voice broke slightly. Ma'am, I deeply regret any consequences of my actions, but I cannot regret attempting to save lives and gather intelligence that might have prevented future attacks. Harrison's final question cut to the heart of military discipline. Captain Vasquez, if you were in the same situation again, would you make the same choice? Elena looked across the courtroom at Colonel Morrison, seeing the pain of a father who had lost his daughter. She thought of Jennifer Morrison, a young soldier whose life had been cut short. She thought of Dmitri Volkov, the wounded man whose plea for mercy had set these events in motion. Yes, ma'am. I would make the same choice. Again, the courtroom was silent. Elena had just sealed her fate, but she had done so with honesty and integrity. She couldn't lie about who she was or what she believed. Even to save her career, Williams's redirect tried to salvage something from Elena's testimony, focusing on her commitment to saving lives and her genuine belief that she was acting in America's best interests. But the damage was done. Elena had admitted that she would disobey orders again under similar circumstances. In the military justice system, that admission was tantamount to a confession of guilt. The deliberation lasted 6 hours. Elena sat in the defendant's holding room, staring at the institutional green walls and wondering what her life would look like after today. Williams had warned her that the testimony had not gone well, that Elena's admission about making the same choice again had essentially guaranteed a conviction. When the court reconvened, Colonel Hayes's expression gave no indication of the verdict. The military members who had served as the jury filed back into the courtroom with the solemn bearing of soldiers who had made a difficult decision. Has the court reached a verdict? Hayes asked. We have, Your Honor. Elena stood, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. This was the moment that would define the rest of her life. On the charge of disobeying direct orders in a combat zone, we find the defendant guilty. Elena felt the world tilt around her. She'd known this moment was coming, but the reality of it still hit like a physical blow. On the charge of conduct unbecoming an officer, we find the defendant guilty. 2 down, 1 to go. The treason charge was the one that would determine whether she spent the next few years in military prison or the next few decades. On the charge of providing aid and comfort to the enemy, we find the defendant not guilty. Elena felt her knees buckle slightly. Not guilty on the treason charge. It wasn't acquittal, but it meant she wouldn't spend the rest of her life behind bars. Colonel Hayes's voice continued with the mechanical precision of military justice. Captain Vasquez, you have been found guilty of disobeying direct orders in a combat zone and conduct unbecoming an officer. Sentencing will take place in 48 hours. Until that time, you will remain in custody. As the military police escorted her from the courtroom, Elena caught sight of her parents in the gallery. Her father, wearing his old army dress uniform, with his Vietnam ribbons, gave her a small nod of support. Her mother was crying, but she managed a trembling smile. The guilty verdict would end her military career and likely result in prison time, but Elena realized she felt something unexpected: relief. The waiting was over. The uncertainty was finished. Now she could begin dealing with the consequences of her choice. Williams caught up with her before she was taken back to detention. Elena, I'm sorry. We knew this was likely, but I'm still sorry. Major, thank you for fighting for me. I know it wasn't an easy case. The sentencing hearing will be important. We'll focus on your military record, your combat service, the extenuating circumstances. I think we can argue for the minimum sentence. Elena nodded, but her mind was already moving beyond the immediate future. She would survive whatever sentence they gave her. The question was what kind of person she would be when she emerged from this ordeal. The sentencing hearing 2 days later was a more subdued affair. The guilt had been established. Now the court needed to determine the appropriate punishment for Elena's crimes. Military justice provided specific guidelines for sentencing, but judges retained some discretion based on mitigating and aggravating factors. Williams had prepared an extensive mitigation package, including letters of support from Elena's former subordinates, her combat citations, and psychological evaluations attesting to her mental health and character. The defense strategy was to portray Elena as a dedicated officer who had made a single, tragic mistake under extreme stress. The prosecution, meanwhile, focused on the consequences of Elena's actions and the need to maintain discipline within the military ranks. Harrison argued that lenient sentencing would send the wrong message to other officers who might be tempted to substitute their judgment for military orders. Colonel Morrison was the first witness at the sentencing hearing. Elena watched him approach the witness stand, knowing that his testimony would likely determine whether she received the minimum or maximum sentence within the guidelines. "Colonel Morrison," Harrison began, "please describe the impact of Captain Vasquez's actions on military operations in your theater of command." Morrison's testimony was devastating in its emotional restraint. He spoke about the breakdown of unit cohesion when officers couldn't trust their subordinates to follow orders. He described the increased security measures that had been necessary after Volkov's escape, measures that had diverted resources from other critical missions, and he spoke about his daughter. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Morrison was 24 years old, he said, his voice steady but his hands gripping the witness stand. She had planned to leave the Army after her deployment and attend graduate school to become a teacher. She wanted to work with special needs children. Elena felt tears burning behind her eyes. She forced herself to listen as Morrison described his daughter's dedication to service, her compassion for others, her bright future that had been cut short by a roadside bomb planted with information that Dmitri Volkov had helped provide. "Colonel Morrison," Harrison continued, "what sentence do you believe would be appropriate for Captain Vasquez?" Morrison looked directly at Elena for the first time during the proceedings. Captain Vasquez was a fine officer before this incident, but her actions cost American lives, including my daughter's life. The maximum sentence within the guidelines would be appropriate not for revenge, but to ensure that other officers understand the consequences of placing personal judgment above military discipline. Williams's cross-examination was gentle, focusing on Morrison's acknowledgement of Elena's previous service record and his understanding that she had believed she was acting in America's best interests. But the colonel's testimony about his daughter's death was devastating and largely unassailable. The next witness surprised Elena. Dr. Foster, the intelligence analyst who had interrogated Volkov, was testifying for the defense. Dr. Foster, Williams began, "You testified during the trial that Mr. Volkov provided no useful intelligence during his interrogation. I want to ask you about the interrogation process itself. Is it unusual for prisoners to withhold information initially?" "Not at all. Trained operatives often require extended interrogation before providing useful intelligence. It's a process that can take weeks or even months. In your professional opinion, was 2 days sufficient time to determine whether Mr. Volkov possessed valuable information?" Dr. Foster hesitated. 2 days is generally insufficient for a complete assessment, particularly with a subject who appears to have received counter-interrogation training. Elena felt a flicker of hope. If the court believed that Volkov might have eventually provided intelligence given more time, it could support her claim that sparing him was a reasonable tactical decision. Harrison's cross-examination quickly extinguished that hope. She established that Volkov's escape had occurred before any extended interrogation could take place, and that his subsequent actions had proven him to be exactly the dangerous operative that Elena's orders had told her to eliminate. The character Witnesses were more encouraging. Marcus Chen testified about Elena's dedication to protecting her subordinates and her consistent pattern of putting American lives above personal considerations. Colonel Matthews spoke about Elena's tactical brilliance and her ability to make difficult decisions under pressure. Dr. Patterson, the combat psychiatrist, returned to testify about the psychological impact of combat stress and the difficulty of maintaining perfect judgment in life or death situations. His testimony provided some context for Elena's decision-making process. Though it couldn't excuse the consequences of her actions, the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, a medic who had served under Elena's command during her second deployment. Santos had requested permission to testify on Elena's behalf, despite the potential impact on her own career. Sergeant Santos, Williams asked, "Please describe Captain Vasquez's leadership style during your deployment to Afghanistan." "Ma'am." Captain Vasquez was the kind of officer who would risk her own life to save any member of her unit. She led from the front, never asked us to do anything she wouldn't do herself, and always made decisions based on what would keep the most Americans alive. Santos described a specific incident where Elena had risked court-martial charges by disobeying orders to abandon a wounded Afghan interpreter who had been helping American forces. Elena's decision to mount a rescue mission had saved the interpreter's life and preserved the relationship with his village, leading to intelligence that prevented several attacks on American convoys. Sergeant Santos, in your opinion, is Captain Vasquez the type of officer who would deliberately endanger American lives? No, ma'am. Everything Captain Vasquez did was focused on protecting people. Sometimes that meant following orders exactly, and sometimes it meant making tough calls that other officers might not have made. But it was always about saving lives. Harrison's cross-examination focused on the distinction between Elena's previous calculated risks that had worked out well and her decision in Syria that had led to American deaths. But Santos's testimony provided a picture of Elena as an officer whose pattern of difficult decisions was motivated by genuine concern for human life. Elena herself testified briefly during the sentencing phase, primarily to express her remorse for the consequences of her actions and her continued commitment to serving her country in whatever capacity remained available to her. "Your Honor," Elena said, "I cannot undo the consequences of my decision in Syria. Staff Sergeant Morrison's death will weigh on my conscience for the rest of my life. But I cannot honestly say that I regret attempting to preserve what I believed to be a valuable intelligence asset. My actions were motivated by my desire to protect American lives, even though the outcome was the opposite of what I intended." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I accept responsibility for my actions and their consequences. Whatever sentence this court deems appropriate, I will serve with the same dedication to honor and duty that has guided my military service for 12 years. The final witness was Elena's father, retired Staff Sergeant Miguel Vasquez. Elena had asked Williams not to call him, not wanting to put her family through the additional stress, but her father had insisted on testifying. Miguel Vasquez approached the witness stand with the bearing of a man who had served his country with distinction and raised his children to do the same. At 68, he still carried himself like a soldier, though the years and his Vietnam War injuries had left their mark. "Mr. Vasquez," Williams began, "please tell the court about your daughter's character and her commitment to military service." Miguel's voice carried the weight of decades of military tradition. "Your Honor, my daughter has wanted to serve in the military since she was 8 years old. She was the first person in our family to attend college, and she chose to use that opportunity to serve her country as an officer." He described Elena's childhood dedication to helping others, her academic achievements, her decision to attend West Point despite having opportunities for civilian scholarships. He spoke about the pride he felt when she received her commission and the worry he experienced during her combat deployments. Mr. Vasquez, how do you view your daughter's actions in Syria? Miguel was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands clasped in front of him. Your Honor, I served in Vietnam. I know what it's like to make impossible choices in impossible situations. My daughter made a choice based on her training, her experience, and her desire to save American lives. The fact that it didn't work out the way she hoped doesn't make her a bad soldier or a bad person. His voice grew stronger. Elena has always been the kind of person who tries to save everyone she can. Sometimes that gets her in trouble, but it's also what makes her the kind of officer that young soldiers want to follow into combat. Harrison's cross-examination was respectful but pointed, establishing that Elena's good intentions couldn't excuse the consequences of her actions or the precedent that lenient sentencing might set for other officers. After closing arguments from both sides, Colonel Hayes announced that sentencing would be pronounced the following morning. Elena spent her final night in pre-sentencing detention, writing letters to her family and trying to prepare herself for whatever the next phase of her life would bring. The courtroom was packed the next morning with military personnel, family members, and media representatives covering what had become a high-profile case about military discipline and moral courage. Elena stood as Colonel Hayes entered, knowing that the next few minutes would determine her immediate future. Captain Elena Vasquez, this court has considered all testimony and evidence regarding your sentencing. The charges of which you have been convicted are serious violations of military discipline, strike at the heart of military effectiveness. Hayes paused, his expression grave. However, this court also recognizes your previous exemplary service record, your combat decorations, and the testimony regarding your character and commitment to protecting American lives. Elena held her breath. It is the sentence of this court that you be dismissed from the United States Army with a dishonorable discharge, forfeit all pay and allowances, and be confined for a period of 4 years. 4 years. It could have been worse, much worse, but it was still 4 years of her life in military prison. Elena felt her legs weaken, but she remained standing at attention. This court acknowledges that your actions were motivated by what you believe to be the best interests of the United States military and the soldiers under your command. Hayes continued. However, military discipline requires that orders be followed, particularly in combat situations where lives depend on unit cohesion and predictable responses to commands. As the military police approached to escort her to confinement, Elena turned to look at her family one last time. Her parents sat in the front row, her father's face stoic, but her mother openly crying. Marcus Chun sat nearby, along with several other officers who had supported her throughout the ordeal, but it was the face in the back row that caught her attention. A young woman in civilian clothes who looked strikingly familiar. Elena realized with a shock that it was Jennifer Morrison's younger sister, Sarah. What was she doing here? Before Elena could process the implications, she was escorted from the courtroom to begin serving her sentence. As the doors closed behind her, she couldn't shake the image of Sarah Morrison's face and the strange expression she had worn, not hatred or anger, but something that looked almost like understanding. The United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, was a world unto itself. Built in 1875, the imposing stone structure had housed military prisoners for nearly 150 years, from deserters in the Indian Wars to war criminals from World War II to modern-day soldiers who had broken military law. Elena's cell was a 6-by-8-foot concrete box with a narrow window that provided a view of the exercise yard and the high walls that separated the prison from the outside world. She had been assigned to work in the prison library, a relatively prestigious job that reflected both her education and her nonviolent offense. 3 months into her sentence, Elena had established a routine that helped her maintain some sense of purpose. She woke at 5:30 a.m. for count, attended mandatory formation, worked in the library for 8 hours, participated in educational programs, and spent her evenings reading or writing in the journal she had been allowed to keep. The other prisoners were a mixed group. Some were career criminals who had found their way into military service. Others were good soldiers who had made catastrophic mistakes. Elena tried to avoid the politics and factions that inevitably developed in any confined population, focusing instead on serving her time quietly and preparing for whatever life awaited her after release. It was during her 3rd month that she received an unexpected visitor. The visiting room at Leavenworth was designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Plastic tables and chairs arranged in neat rows, with guards stationed at regular intervals to monitor conversations. Elena entered wearing her prison uniform, surprised to see Sarah Morrison sitting at one of the tables. Jennifer Morrison's younger sister was 22, with the same blonde hair and blue eyes as her father, but a softer expression that spoke of someone who had chosen civilian life over military service. She was a graduate student at Georgetown University, studying international relations with a focus on conflict resolution. "Miss Morrison," Elena said as she sat down across from her, "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Sarah's hands were folded on the table, and Elena could see that she was nervous. "Captain Vasquez, I mean. Miss Vasquez, I hope you don't mind my coming. I know this might be uncomfortable for you. I'm the one who should be apologizing to you. I'm sorry for your loss. Your sister was a good soldier." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "That's actually why I'm here. I've been struggling with Jenny's death, trying to understand what happened, and I've been doing research into the case." Elena felt a knot forming in her stomach. "Sarah, I know that my decision to spare Dmitri Volkov contributed to your sister's death. Nothing I say can change that or make it better." "That's just it," Sarah said, leaning forward. "I don't think it did." Elena stared at her, not understanding. "What do you mean?" Sarah pulled a manila folder from her bag and opened it on the table. Inside were copies of intelligence reports, news articles, and what appeared to be official correspondence. "I've been investigating the circumstances of Jenny's death, and I found some things that don't match the official story," she showed Elena a copy of an intelligence report dated 3 days before Volkov's capture. This report shows that the Crimson Dawn network had been planning attacks on convoy routes in Jenny's sector for at least 2 weeks before you encountered Volkov. The intelligence used to plan those attacks came from a mole inside the Iraqi security forces, not from anything Volkov could have learned during his captivity. Elena felt her heart racing. "Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure. I've talked to intelligence analysts, reviewed intercepts, even interviewed some of Jenny's fellow soldiers. The evidence shows that Volkov's escape may have coincided with the attack that killed my sister, but it didn't cause it." Sarah pulled out another document, this one bearing the seal of the Defense Intelligence Agency. "This is a classified assessment of Crimson Dawn operations in Syria, declassified last month as part of an ongoing investigation. It confirms that the attack on Jenny's convoy was planned and executed independently of any intelligence Volkov might have provided." Elena stared at the documents, her mind reeling. If Sarah was right, then Elena's court-martial had been based on false premises. She had been convicted for causing a death that would have happened regardless of her actions. "Sarah, why are you showing me this? Why would you investigate your own sister's death to help someone your father believes is responsible for it?" Sarah's composure finally cracked, and tears began flowing down her cheeks. "Because Jenny wouldn't want an innocent person to suffer for something she didn't do. Because the truth matters more than revenge, and because—" She hesitated, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "Because I think you did the right thing." Elena felt as if the world had shifted around her. The right thing? Jenny used to write to me about the things she saw overseas. The civilian casualties, the moral compromises, the way war forces people to make impossible choices. She told me once that she hoped she would have the courage to choose compassion over orders if she ever faced that kind of decision. Sarah gathered the documents and put them back in the folder. I've given copies of everything to Major Williams. She's filing an appeal based on new evidence. But I wanted you to know personally that my sister's death isn't your fault, and that there are people who believe what you did was brave, not treasonous." After Sarah left, Elena sat in her cell staring at the concrete walls and trying to process what she had learned. If the new evidence was accurate, her sacrifice had been even more meaningless than she had thought. She had destroyed her career and lost 4 years of her life for a decision that had no impact on subsequent events. But somehow, that realization didn't make her regret her choice. She had acted according to her principles, based on the information available to her at the time. The fact that circumstances beyond her control had rendered her decision irrelevant didn't change the moral calculation she had faced in that abandoned school in Syria. That evening, Elena received a call from Major Williams. "Elena, I've reviewed the materials that Sarah Morrison provided. This is potentially explosive. If we can verify these intelligence reports and get corroborating testimony, we might be able to overturn your conviction entirely." Elena felt a seco ida felt a sepultura flicker of hope, but it was tempered by years of disappointment and the reality of military justice. "Major, what are the realistic chances of success?" "Honestly, it's difficult to say. Overturning a court-martial conviction requires demonstrating that new evidence would have materially affected the verdict. The fact that Volkov didn't actually contribute to Staff Sergeant Morrison's death is significant, but the prosecution could argue that you still disobeyed orders and that the potential for harm existed regardless of the actual outcome." Williams paused. "But Elena, this is the best shock you're going to get. Sarah Morrison has done remarkable work gathering this evidence, and her willingness to testify on your behalf carries enormous weight given who she is. What's the next step?" "I'm filing a formal appeal with the Army Court of Criminal Appeals. It'll take time, probably 6 to 8 months just to get a hearing. But if we're successful, you could be exonerated completely and have your rank restored." After the call ended, Elena lay on her narrow bunk staring at the ceiling. 6 to 8 months meant she would serve at least half of her sentence before any appeal could be heard. It also meant living with hope, which in many ways was more difficult than accepting her fate. The next morning brought another surprise: a visit from Colonel Hayes, the judge who had presided over her court-martial. Elena was escorted to a private meeting room normally used for attorney consultations. "Ms. Vasquez," Hayes said as she entered, "thank you for agreeing to see me." Elena remained standing until Hayes gestured for her to sit. As a former officer, she was unsure of the proper protocol for meeting with the judge who had sentenced her. "Colonel, I'm not sure this meeting is appropriate. Shouldn't any communication go through my attorney?" Hayes nodded. "You're absolutely right, and I want to be clear that I'm not here in any official capacity. I'm here because Sarah Morrison contacted me about her research, and I felt obligated to discuss the implications with you personally." He pulled out a copy of the same intelligence reports Sarah had shown Elena the day before. "Ms. Vasquez, I've spent 30 years in military justice, and I've seen cases where new evidence emerged after conviction. This is one of the most compelling post-conviction investigations I've encountered." Elena felt her pulse quickening. "Colonel, are you saying you believe my conviction was wrong?" "I'm saying that the evidence suggests your actions did not contribute to Staff Sergeant Morrison's death, which was a central element of your sentencing calculation." Hayes leaned forward. "Ms. Vasquez, I want you to understand that your appeal has merit. Real merit. The evidence Sarah Morrison has gathered calls into question fundamental assumptions about causation that influenced both your conviction and your sentence." He stood up, preparing to leave. "I can't comment on the likelihood of success. That's not my role anymore. But I can tell you that if I were still on the bench and this evidence had been available during your trial, it would have significantly impacted my decisions." After Hayes left, Elena sat alone in the meeting room for several minutes, trying to absorb the implications of what she had heard. A respected military judge believed her appeal had merit. The victim's sister was advocating for her exoneration. New evidence suggested her actions hadn't caused the death she had been blamed for, but even if her conviction was overturned, 4 months of her life would still be gone. Her military career was still over. And somewhere in Syria, the war continued. With all its moral complexities and impossible choices, Elena realized that her feelings about potential exoneration were complicated. Part of her desperately wanted vindication, wanted to be proven right about her decision to show mercy. But another part of her had made peace with the consequences of her choice, and wasn't sure she wanted to reopen old wounds. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being offered the possibility of redemption by the sister of the woman whose death had been used to justify her conviction. Jennifer Morrison, the young soldier Elena had never met, was reaching across the grave to offer forgiveness and truth. That night, Elena wrote in her journal for the first time in weeks, day 90 of confinement. Everything I thought I knew about. My case has been turned upside down. Sarah Morrison's investigation suggests that Jenny's death wasn't connected to my decision to spare Volkov. If true, it means I'd been carrying guilt for something I didn't cause, punished for consequences that weren't really consequences. But here's what I keep coming back to. Even if Volkov hadn't escaped, even if he'd provided valuable intelligence, even if my decision had saved lives instead of allegedly costing them, I would still have disobeyed direct orders. I would still have chosen mercy over military discipline. The question isn't whether I'm guilty of the specific charges they convicted me of. The question is whether I'm the kind of person who can follow orders that violate my conscience, and whether the military has room for officers who sometimes choose compassion over compliance. Maybe the appeal will succeed. Maybe I'll be exonerated. But I don't think I'll ever be the same kind of soldier I was before Syria. Some lines, once crossed, change you forever. Elena closed the journal and prepared for another night in her concrete cell, knowing that morning would bring either another day of imprisonment or another step toward an uncertain redemption. The midpoint of her journey had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same. We're approaching the climactic moments of this epic tale, and the tension is at its peak. Creating stories of this scope and detail requires not just writing talent, but careful plotting, character development, and attention to every narrative thread. We've journeyed through nearly 40,000 words together, and I hope every moment has kept you engaged. If this story has drawn you in and kept you listening, please show your appreciation by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Share this epic with anyone who loves immersive storytelling and hit that notification bell for more incredible adventures. Now let's witness how everything comes together in these final, crucial moments. The appeal process moved with the glacial pace that characterized military bureaucracy. 6 months after Sarah Morrison's visit, Elena had received only periodic updates from Major Williams about the progress of her case. The Army Court of Criminal Appeals had agreed to hear the appeal, but scheduling and procedural requirements meant the hearing was still months away. Elena had been transferred to minimum security status after 4 months of good behavior, which allowed her more freedom within the prison compound and access to additional educational programs. She had enrolled in correspondence courses in international law and conflict resolution, partly to occupy her mind and partly because she was beginning to think about what kind of work she might do after her release. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered with the regular mail call. Elena recognized the return address immediately, the office of the Army Court of Criminal Appeals. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope, knowing that the contents would either offer hope for vindication or confirm that she would serve the remainder of her sentence. United States v. Vasquez. Elena M.K. Snow, ACCA 2025-0847. Ms. Vasquez, The Army Court of Criminal Appeals has reviewed your petition for appeal based on new evidence. After careful consideration of the materials submitted by your counsel, including intelligence reports and testimony from government witnesses, this court has determined that an evidentiary hearing is warranted to examine claims that material evidence was not available during your original court-martial. Your appeal hearing is scheduled for May 15, 2025, at 09:00 hours at the Army Court of Criminal Appeals, Arlington, Virginia. You will be transported from confinement to attend this hearing in person. The scope of this hearing will be limited to determining whether the new evidence presented would have materially affected the verdict or sentence in your original court-martial. Elena. Read the letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. She was getting her hearing. More than a year after her conviction, she would have the opportunity to present the evidence that Sarah Morrison had uncovered. But the letter also contained a sobering reminder. Even if the appeals court found merit in the new evidence, it could still uphold her conviction on the grounds that she had admitted to disobeying orders. Overturning a court-martial conviction required more than just questioning one element of the prosecution's case. That evening, Elena called Major Williams to discuss the hearing strategy. "Elena, this is a significant development," Williams said. "The fact that they're granting an evidentiary hearing suggests that the appeals court believes the new intelligence reports raise serious questions about your case." "Major, what exactly do we need to prove to win the appeal?" "We need to demonstrate that the evidence about Jenny Morrison's death being unrelated to Volkov's escape would have materially affected either your conviction or your sentence. Conviction might be harder to overturn since you admitted to disobeying orders, but we have a strong case for arguing that your sentence was influenced by the belief that your actions caused an American death." Williams paused. "There's something else, Elena. Sarah Morrison has been in contact with other intelligence analysts who worked on the Crimson Dawn investigation. She's found additional evidence that supports her findings, including intercepts that show the attack on her sister's convoy was planned weeks before Volkov was even captured." Elena felt a familiar mixture of hope and apprehension. Who's going to testify at the hearing? Sarah Morrison, obviously. Dr. Foster has agreed to revise her assessment of Volkov's intelligence value based on the new information. We're also trying to get testimony from the DIA analyst who wrote the classified report that contradicts the original timeline. The weeks leading up to the hearing were a strange mixture of anticipation and routine. Elena continued her work in the prison library, attended her correspondence classes, and tried to maintain the emotional equilibrium she had developed during her confinement. But the approaching hearing made it difficult to focus on anything else. 2 days before the scheduled hearing, Elena received another unexpected visitor, Dmitri Volkov. The revelation that her former prisoner was requesting to see her came through the prison administration with no explanation. Elena's first instinct was to refuse the meeting, seeing Volkov would only remind her of the decision that had destroyed her career. But curiosity eventually overcame her reluctance. Volkov looked different than she remembered. The desperate, wounded man she had encountered in Syria had been replaced by someone who appeared healthy and confident. He was wearing civilian clothes and spoke with the calm demeanor of someone who had made peace with his circumstances. "Captain Vasquez," he said as he sat down across from her. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Elena studied his face, looking for some sign of the person whose plea for mercy had changed the course of her life. "Mr. Volkov, I have to admit, I'm surprised you're here." "And surprised you free." Volkov nodded. "My legal status is complicated. I am cooperating with American intelligence services in exchange for certain considerations. That cooperation has included providing information about the circumstances of our encounter in Syria." Elena felt her heart rate increasing. "What kind of information?" "The truth about what I told you that day. The truth about the intelligence I offered to provide." Volkov leaned forward slightly. "Captain, I need you to understand that what you did sparing my life was based on accurate information. I did possess intelligence about planned attacks. Valuable intelligence that could have saved American lives. Elena stared at him, not understanding. But Dr. Foster testified that you provided no useful information during your interrogation, because I never had the opportunity to provide it. During my interrogation, I was treated as a routine prisoner being processed for information about tactical operations. No one asked me about the strategic intelligence I possessed regarding Crimson Dawn's planned operations in other sectors. Volkov pulled out a folder that had been approved for the visit. I am here because I will be testifying at your appeal hearing. I will be telling the court about the intelligence I offered to provide, intelligence that your superiors never bothered to ask about because they had already decided I was worthless. Elena felt the room spinning slightly. What kind of intelligence? Locations of weapons caches, identities of financial supporters, planned operations against civilian targets in Europe and the United States. Information that took intelligence. Services 8 months to gather through other means after my escape. He opened the folder and showed her copies of debriefing reports, intelligence assessments, and operational summaries. This information led to the prevention of 3 major terrorist attacks, including one planned for Washington, D.C. It also led to the capture of 12 high-value targets and the disruption of Crimson Dawn's financial network. Elena struggled to process what she was hearing. Why didn't you provide this information during your original interrogation? Because the interrogators were focused on immediate tactical intelligence locations of weapons, plans for local attacks, identities of other operatives in the immediate area. They never asked about broader strategic operations because they assumed a field operative wouldn't have access to that level of information. Volkov's expression grew more serious. Captain, I need you to understand something else. The attack that killed Staff Sergeant Morrison was not planned using intelligence I provided. I know this because I was not involved in planning operations in that sector, and the intelligence used for that attack came from sources that were already compromised. Before my capture, Elena felt tears burning behind her eyes. Then why didn't you tell someone this earlier? Why didn't you try to help with my court-martial? Because I was not in American custody earlier. After my escape, I spent months moving between safe houses, trying to decide whether to continue fighting or to offer cooperation to American forces. It was only when I learned about your case through intelligence channels that I decided to make contact with your government. Volkov closed the folder and looked directly at Elena. Captain, I am here because your decision to show mercy was the right decision. It was based on accurate assessment of potential intelligence value, and it ultimately led to operations that saved civilian lives. The fact that your military justice system convicted you without fully investigating the circumstances is a failure of the system, not a failure of your judgment. The visit lasted only 30 minutes, but it left Elena emotionally exhausted. Everything she thought she knew about her case was proving to be wrong. Not only had her decision not caused Jenny Morrison's death, but it had potentially prevented other deaths by keeping alive someone who would eventually provide valuable intelligence. That night, Elena barely slept. The implications of Volkov's testimony were staggering. If he was telling the truth, and the documentation he had shown her suggested he was, then her entire court-martial had been based on incomplete and inaccurate information. But Elena realized that her feelings about the case were more complicated than simple vindication. She had spent months in prison coming to terms with the consequences of her choice, accepting responsibility for what she believed had been a tragic mistake. Learning that her choice had actually been correct was gratifying, but it also meant she had suffered needlessly for something that wasn't her fault. The morning of the appeal hearing arrived with unseasonably cold weather for May in Virginia. Elena was transported from Leavenworth to Arlington in a military vehicle, wearing the civilian clothes that Major Williams had brought for her appearance. After more than a year in prison uniforms, the simple business suit felt strange and formal. Army Court of Criminal Appeals was located in a modern building that reflected the military's attempt to balance tradition with contemporary efficiency. The hearing room was smaller than the court-martial venue, designed for appellate proceedings rather than full trials. Elena sat beside Major Williams at the appellant's table, watching as the three-judge panel that would decide her fate entered the room. The presiding judge was Colonel Margaret Sullivan, a respected jurist known for her careful analysis of complex cases. The other judges were Colonel David Kim and Colonel Robert Torres, both with extensive experience in military appeals. "The Court of Criminal Appeals will come to order," Colonel Sullivan announced. "We are here to consider the appeal of United States v. Vasquez, based on claims of newly discovered evidence that was not available during the original court-martial." The hearing began with Major Williams presenting an overview of the new evidence, including the intelligence reports that Sarah Morrison had uncovered and the revelations about the true timeline of Staff Sergeant Morrison's death. The judges asked detailed questions about why this evidence hadn't been available during the original trial, and what impact it might have had on the verdict. Sarah Morrison was the first witness, and her testimony was as compelling as Elena had expected. She methodically walked through her investigation, explaining how she had obtained intelligence reports, interviewed analysts, and documented the evidence that contradicted the prosecution's case at Elena's court-martial. "Miss Morrison," Colonel Sullivan asked, "what motivated you to undertake this investigation?" "Your Honor, I wanted to understand the truth about my sister's death. When I began researching the circumstances, I discovered discrepancies between the official account and the available evidence. As someone studying international relations and conflict resolution, I felt obligated to pursue the truth regardless of personal cost." Sarah's voice remained steady despite the emotional weight of her testimony. "My research conclusively demonstrates that the attack which killed my sister was planned and executed independently of any intelligence that Mr. Volkov could have provided during his brief captivity. The prosecution's case was built on a false premise." Dr. Foster followed Sarah to the witness stand, and her revised testimony was devastating to the original prosecution case. Armed with the complete intelligence picture that hadn't been available during Elena's court-martial, she acknowledged that her original assessment of Volkov's value had been incomplete. "Dr. Foster," Williams asked, "based on the intelligence reports that have since been declassified, do you wish to revise your assessment of Mr. Volkov's potential intelligence value?" "Yes, I do. The reports clearly indicate that Mr. Volkov possessed strategic intelligence about Crimson Dawn operations that was far more valuable than the tactical information we were seeking during his original interrogation. Had we known the scope of his knowledge, our interrogation approach would have been entirely different." The government attorney, Major Stevens, cross-examined Dr. Foster aggressively, trying to establish that Elena couldn't have known about Volkov's strategic intelligence value when she made her decision to spare him. But Dr. Foster's revised testimony supported Elena's claim that she had correctly assessed Volkov as a valuable intelligence asset. The most dramatic moment came when Dmitri Volkov took the stand. Elena watched him carefully as he was sworn in, still struggling to reconcile the confident man before her with the desperate, wounded soldier she had encountered in Syria. "Mr. Volkov," Williams began, "please describe what you told Captain Vasquez when she encountered you in the abandoned school." Volkov's English was heavily accented but clear. "I told Captain Vasquez that I had important information about planned attacks. This was true. I possessed detailed knowledge of Crimson Dawn's strategic operations, including planned attacks in Europe and the United States. Why didn't you provide this information during your subsequent interrogation?" "Because the interrogators were focused on immediate tactical intelligence. They asked about local weapons caches and regional operations. They never asked about strategic planning or international operations because they assumed a field operative would not have access to such information. Williams walked Volkov through the intelligence he had eventually provided to American authorities after his recapture, including details about prevented terrorist attacks and dismantled networks. The scope of the intelligence was staggering, far more valuable than anyone had realized during Elena's court-martial. Major Stevens's cross-examination was brutal, focusing on Volkov's terrorist activities and his motivations for cooperating with American forces. But Volkov's testimony about the intelligence he had offered remained consistent and credible. "Mr. Volkov, are you testifying today in hopes of receiving more favorable treatment from American authorities?" "No, sir. My cooperation agreement is already in place. I am testifying because Captain Vasquez made the correct tactical decision based on accurate information, and she has been punished for something that was not her fault." The final witness was Colonel Patricia Hayes, the Defense Intelligence Agency analyst who had written the classified report that contradicted the original timeline of Staff Sergeant Morrison's death. Her testimony was technical but devastating, providing minute-by-minute documentation that proved the attack had been planned. Weeks before Volkov's capture, after the witness testimony concluded, both sides presented their closing arguments. Major Williams argued that the new evidence completely undermined the prosecution's case, demonstrating that Elena's decision had been tactically sound and that the consequences attributed to her actions had actually resulted from independent factors. Major Stevens, representing the government, acknowledged the significance of the new evidence, but argued that Elena had still deliberately disobeyed direct orders, regardless of the ultimate consequences. He contended that military discipline required adherence to orders even when officers believed their personal judgment was superior. The judges deliberated for 2 hours. Elena spent the time in a small conference room with Major Williams, trying to prepare herself for either outcome. After more than a year in prison, she had learned to manage her expectations and protect herself from excessive hope. When the court reconvened, Colonel Sullivan's expression was unreadable. "Ms. Vasquez, please stand." Elena rose, feeling the weight of the moment. This decision would determine not just her immediate future, but how she would remember this chapter of her life for decades to come. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, this court finds that the newly discovered intelligence reports and testimony constitute material evidence that was not available during your original court-martial, and that would have substantially affected both the verdict and sentence. Elena felt her knees weaken slightly, but she remained standing. "The evidence demonstrates that your assessment of the prisoner's potential intelligence value was accurate, that your decision did not contribute to Staff Sergeant Morrison's death, and that the intelligence ultimately provided by Mr. Volkov led to operations that prevented civilian casualties." Colonel Sullivan paused, consulting her notes. "While this court acknowledges that you did technically disobey direct orders, the evidence shows that your decision was based on sound tactical judgment and resulted in positive outcomes for American security interests." Elena's heart was racing, but she forced herself to remain calm. "It is the decision of this court to overturn your conviction on all charges. Your rank of captain is hereby restored, and you are entitled to full back pay for the period of your wrongful confinement. The dishonorable discharge is vacated, and your military record will reflect an honorable separation from service." The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration from Elena's supporters. Sarah Morrison was crying openly, her research and advocacy having achieved complete vindication. Major Williams was gathering her papers with the satisfied expression of someone who had just won the most important case of her career, but Elena felt strangely numb. After more than a year of imprisonment, after accepting her fate and learning to live with the consequences of her choice, vindication felt almost surreal. She was free, exonerated, and financially compensated for her wrongful conviction. Everything she had hoped for had come to pass, yet as she left the courthouse that afternoon, Elena realized that prison had changed her in ways that vindication couldn't undo. She was no longer the confident young officer who had made a split-second decision. In a Syrian school, she was someone who had been tested by the military justice system and found it wanting. Someone who had learned that doing the right thing sometimes came with a price that was both unjust and necessary. Elena's release from Leavenworth 3 days after her successful appeal was a media event that she hadn't anticipated. News organizations had followed her case throughout the appeals process, and her vindication had become a symbol for debates about military justice, moral courage, and the complexities of modern warfare. The prison gates opened at dawn to reveal a crowd of reporters, cameras, and supporters who had gathered to witness her freedom. Elena emerged wearing the same civilian clothes she had worn to her appeal hearing, carrying a small bag containing the few personal items she had been allowed to keep during her confinement. Major Williams was waiting beside a military vehicle, along with Sarah Morrison and Elena's parents, who had flown in from Texas for her release. The reunion with her family was emotional but brief. Elena was overwhelmed by the attention and eager to escape the media circus. "Mia," her mother whispered through tears as they embraced, "we always knew you did the right thing." Her father, wearing his old army uniform for the occasion, simply nodded and said, "Welcome home, soldier." The drive to Washington, D.C. gave Elena her first real opportunity to process what had happened. She was free, vindicated, and entitled to significant financial compensation for her wrongful imprisonment. But she was also 34 years old, with a gap in her employment history and uncertain prospects for rebuilding her life. "Elena," Major Williams said as they drove through the Virginia countryside, "I need to discuss some practical matters with you. The Army has offered you the opportunity to return to active duty with a promotion to major and a choice of assignments. They're essentially trying to make amends for what happened." Elena stared out the window at the familiar landscape she'd been separated from for more than a year. "What kind of assignments?" "Teaching positions at West Point or the Command and General Staff College. Staff positions at the Pentagon. Basically, anything that would allow you to complete your 20 years and retire with full benefits." The offer was generous, more than generous. It would restore her military career and provide financial security for the rest of her life. But Elena found herself hesitant to commit to returning to an institution that had so thoroughly failed her. "I need time to think about it," she said. Sarah Morrison had been quiet during the drive, but she spoke up from the back seat. "Elena, I've been thinking about something. Your case has raised important questions about military justice and the treatment of conscientious decisions in combat. There are organizations that work on these issues, think tanks, advocacy groups, universities. Your experience gives you unique credibility to speak about these problems." Elena turned to look at her. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that your vindication is just the beginning. There are other cases like yours, other officers who've been punished for making moral choices in impossible situations. Your voice could make a difference in how the military handles these issues in the future." That evening, Elena sat in a hotel room in Arlington, staring at the television as news programs discussed her case and its implications. Legal experts debated military justice reform. Veterans advocates called for changes to how moral courage was evaluated in military courts. Politicians issued statements about the need to support service members who faced difficult ethical decisions, but Elena found herself thinking less about policy implications and more about the individual human costs of military service. She thought about Jennifer Morrison, the young soldier whose death had been wrongly attributed to Elena's decision. She thought about Dmitri Volkov, whose cooperation had ultimately saved lives, but who remained a former enemy combatant navigating his own complex relationship with American justice. Most of all, she thought about the thousands of service members who faced moral dilemmas every day in combat zones around the world. making split-second decisions with life and death consequences and limited information. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. Captain Vasquez? This is General Patricia Morrison, Commanding General of the Army's Training and Doctrine Command. Elena recognized the name. Morrison was one of the Army's most senior female officers and had no relation to Colonel Morrison or his daughter Jennifer. Yes, General. How can I help you? Captain, I wanted to personally congratulate you on your vindication and to discuss an opportunity that might interest you. I've been following your case closely, and I believe your experience could be valuable in reforming how we train officers to handle ethical dilemmas in combat. General Morrison explained that the Army was developing new training programs focused on moral courage and ethical decision-making under pressure. Elena's case had highlighted gaps in how officers were prepared for situations where regulations and moral imperatives might conflict. I'm offering you the opportunity to help design and implement these programs. It would involve working with training commands, war colleges, and operational units to develop better frameworks for ethical decision-making in combat situations. The offer was intriguing, an opportunity to turn her experience into something constructive that could help other officers avoid similar situations. General, I appreciate the offer, but I need to be honest. I'm not sure I want to remain in the military after what I've been through. I understand your hesitation, Captain. But consider this. You have unique credibility to speak about these issues precisely because you've been through the system and emerged vindicated. Your voice could carry weight with officers who might otherwise dismiss ethical training as academic nonsense. After the call ended, Elena sat quietly for a long time, weighing her options. She could return to active duty and complete her military career. She could leave the service entirely and pursue civilian opportunities. Or she could find a way to use her experience to make positive changes in the institution that had failed. The next morning brought another unexpected visitor, Colonel Morrison, Jennifer's father and the man who had prosecuted her case so vigorously. They met in the hotel's coffee shop, a neutral space that felt safer than a more formal setting. Morrison looked older than Elena remembered, wearing civilian clothes that made him seem smaller and more vulnerable than the imposing figure who had dominated her court-martial. Captain Vasquez, he said as he sat down across from her. I owe you an apology. Elena studied his face, looking for signs of the anger and certainty that had characterized his testimony at her trial. Instead, she saw a father struggling with grief and guilt. Colonel, you did what you believed was right, based on the information available at the time. We both did. Morrison shook his head. No, Captain. I did what my grief demanded, not what justice required. I wanted someone to blame for Jennifer's death, and you were a convenient target. The fact that you had disobeyed orders made it easy to convince myself that you were responsible. He pulled out a worn photograph and placed it on the table between them. It showed a young woman in army fatigues, smiling at the camera with Jennifer. Morrison's distinctive blue eyes. Jennifer wrote to me about moral dilemmas she faced overseas. She struggled with some of the same issues you faced, orders that seemed to conflict with her values, situations where compassion and military discipline pointed in different directions. Morrison's voice grew softer. She would have been proud of what you did in Syria. She would have admired your courage in choosing mercy over orders, even knowing the potential consequences. Elena felt tears threatening. Colonel, your daughter was a good soldier. Her death was a tragedy that had nothing to do with my decision. I'm sorry you had to learn that in such a painful way. Captain, I've spent the past year blaming you for something that wasn't your fault. I've realized that my anger was really directed at a war that puts young people in impossible situations and forces them to make choices that no one should have to make. Morrison stood up, preparing to leave. I wanted you to know that I'm supporting General Morrison's proposal for ethical training programs. If you decide to work on those programs, You'll have my full support and cooperation." After he left, Elena remained in the coffee shop for another hour, processing the conversation and its implications. The man who had been her primary antagonist had become an unexpected ally in her consideration of how to move forward. That afternoon, Elena received a call from Marcus Chun, her former West Point classmate, who had supported her throughout the ordeal. "Elena, I heard about your vindication. Congratulations, you deserve this." "Thanks, Marcus. It's still sinking in. Listen, I'm calling because I have a proposition for you. I'm leaving active duty next month to take a position with a defense contractor that specializes in military ethics and training. We're looking for someone with your background and credibility to head up our new program on moral courage in combat situations." The offer was another option to consider, a civilian position that would allow her to work on military issues without being subject to military authority. "Marcus, I appreciate the offer, but I'm still weighing my options. General Morrison has offered me something similar within the Army structure. Elena, whatever you decide, I want you to know that your case has already made a difference. Junior officers are talking about moral courage in ways they never did before. You've opened up conversations about the balance between orders and conscience. That needed to happen." That evening, Elena walked the streets of Arlington, passing the Pentagon and other symbols of American military power. She thought about the decision she had made in a Syrian school that had led to this moment, and about the decisions she faced now that would determine the next chapter of her life. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Captain Vasquez, this is Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. I testified against you at your court-martial, and I've regretted it every day since. I hope you can forgive me. You were the best officer I ever served under, and I should have had the courage to say that when it mattered. Congratulations on your vindication." Elena stared at the message for a long time. Rodriguez's testimony had been damaging, but she understood the pressure he had faced to conform to the official narrative. Military culture discouraged subordinates from contradicting their superiors, especially in legal proceedings. She typed back, "Sergeant, you did what you thought was right under difficult circumstances. No apology necessary. Thank you for your service and your message." As she returned to her hotel, Elena realized that her decision about the future couldn't be based solely on personal considerations. Too many people had invested too much in her. Vindication for her to simply walk away. Sarah Morrison had risked her academic career to investigate her sister's death. Major Williams had fought tirelessly for justice. General Morrison was offering her the chance to make systemic changes that could help other officers. Even Colonel Morrison, the man who had prosecuted her, was now supporting efforts to reform the system that had failed both of them. Elena's personal journey from disgraced officer to vindicated veteran was complete. But her public role as a symbol of moral courage and military justice reform was just beginning. The question was whether she was prepared to accept that responsibility and the scrutiny that would come with it. Weeks after her release from Leavenworth, Elena stood before a packed auditorium at Georgetown University, delivering her first public speech about her experience and its implications for military justice. Sarah Morrison had organized the event as part of her graduate program's speaker series, and the response had exceeded everyone's expectations. The audience included military officers, law students, policy experts, and journalists, people who were grappling with the complex questions that Elena's case had raised about conscience, duty, and institutional accountability. 18 months ago, Elena began, I made a decision in a Syrian school that destroyed my military career and sent me to prison. Today, I stand before you vindicated by an appeals court that found I had made the right choice for the right reasons. But vindication doesn't erase the year I spent in prison, and it doesn't resolve the fundamental questions about how military institutions handle moral complexity. Elena had spent days preparing her remarks. working with Sarah Morrison and Major Williams to craft a message that was both personal and policy-focused. She wanted to tell her story in a way that honored all the people who had been affected by her case while also advancing constructive discussions about military reform. The military justice system failed in my case not because of malicious intent, but because it was designed for a simpler world where orders were clear and consequences were predictable. Modern warfare presents moral dilemmas that our institutions are not equipped to handle, and good people suffer as a result. She described her decision-making process in Syria, the court-martial proceedings, and the investigation that had ultimately led to her vindication. But she also spoke about the broader implications for military culture and the need for institutional changes that would support moral courage rather than punish it. We need training programs that prepare officers for ethical dilemmas they will face in combat. We need legal frameworks that recognize the complexity of modern warfare. And we need a culture that values moral courage as much as it values following orders. During the question and answer session, Elena was asked about her plans for the future. I've decided to accept General Morrison's offer to work on developing ethical training programs for the Army. This decision hasn't been easy. Part of me wants to leave the institution that failed me and build a new life in the civilian world. But I believe I have a responsibility to use my experience to help other officers who might face similar situations. The applause was sustained and enthusiastic. Elena felt a sense of purpose that had been missing since her release from prison. She was no longer just a victim of military injustice. She was becoming an advocate for positive change. After the speech, Elena was approached by Dr. Elizabeth Carter, a professor of international relations who had written extensively about civil-military relations and military ethics. Captain Vasquez, your remarks tonight were extraordinarily compelling. I wanted to discuss an opportunity that might interest you. I'm organizing a research project on moral courage in military institutions funded by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We're looking for someone with your background to serve as a senior research fellow. Dr. Carter explained that the position would involve studying cases similar to Elena's, developing policy recommendations for military justice reform, and working with international partners to share best practices for handling ethical dilemmas in military institutions. The position would be based here in Washington, with opportunities for international travel and collaboration with defense institutions around the world. It would allow you to influence policy at the highest levels while maintaining some independence from military authority. The offer was tempting, an opportunity to work on the issues Elena cared about without being constrained by military hierarchy. But she had already committed to working with the Army on training programs, and she felt obligated to honor that commitment. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Dr. Carter, I appreciate the offer, but I've already accepted a position working on military ethics training within the Army. I believe change is more likely to succeed if it comes from within the institution. I understand, and I respect your decision. But please keep the offer in mind. Our project will be ongoing for several years, and there may be opportunities for collaboration even if you remain in your military position. The following week, Elena reported to Fort Monroe, Virginia, to begin her new assignment as Director of Ethical Leadership Development for the Army's Training and Doctrine Command. Her office was in a modern building that housed various training and doctrine development functions, a far cry from the austere environment she had known during her combat deployments. General Morrison had assembled a small team to work on the ethical training programs, including military officers, civilian academics, and experts in adult education. Elena's role was to lead the development of training scenarios and curricula that would prepare officers for the moral dilemmas they might face in combat. Her first major project was developing case studies based on real-world ethical dilemmas. including her own experience in Syria. Working with Dr. Foster and other intelligence professionals, Elena created detailed scenarios that captured the complexity of combat, decision-making without compromising operational security. The case studies were designed to be used in war college courses, officer development programs, and unit training exercises. Each scenario presented officers with incomplete information, conflicting priorities, and time pressure, forcing them to make decisions and then analyze the reasoning behind their choices. The goal isn't to provide easy answers, Elena explained to her team during one of their weekly planning meetings. The goal is to help officers develop frameworks for thinking through ethical dilemmas and to create a culture where moral courage is valued and supported. One of Elena's most important collaborators was Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Kim, a military lawyer who specialized in operational law and rules of engagement. Kim had followed Elena's case closely and had been advocating for reforms to military justice procedures even before Elena's vindication. Elena, one of the things your case highlighted is the gap between legal training and ethical training for officers, Kim said during one of their working sessions. Officers learn the rules of engagement and the laws of armed conflict, but they don't get much preparation for situations where legal compliance and moral courage might point in different directions. Together, Elena and Kim developed training modules that address the relationship between legal obligations and ethical responsibilities. They created exercises that forced officers to grapple with situations where following orders might be legal but morally questionable, or where moral courage might require accepting legal risks. The work was challenging and rewarding, but Elena found herself struggling with the irony of her situation. She was developing training programs to help officers avoid the kind of situation that had destroyed her own career, working within the same institution that had failed her so dramatically. 6 months into her new assignment, Elena received an unexpected phone call from Dmitri Volkov. "Captain Vasquez, I hope you do not mind my calling. I wanted to inform you of some developments that may interest you." Volkov explained that his cooperation with American intelligence services had expanded beyond his original agreement. He was now working as a consultant on counterterrorism operations, using his knowledge of extremist networks to help prevent attacks against civilian targets. "I wanted you to know that the intelligence I provided has led to significant successes. 3 major attacks have been prevented, and several important operational leaders have been captured. Your decision to spare my life has had consequences that extend far beyond what either of us imagined." Elena was glad to hear that Volkov's cooperation was producing positive results, but she was still uncomfortable with their relationship. He remained a former enemy combatant whose past actions had resulted in American deaths, even if his current cooperation was valuable. "Mr. Volkov, I'm pleased that your information is helping to save lives. That makes everything we went through feel more worthwhile. Captain, there is something else. I have been working with American authorities to identify other individuals within extremist networks who might be willing to provide cooperation. Your case has become known within intelligence circles as an example of the value of preserving potential assets rather than automatically eliminating them." The conversation left Elena with mixed feelings. She was gratified that her decision was producing ongoing benefits, but she was also aware that her case was being used to justify intelligence policies that she might not fully support. That evening, Elena called Sarah Morrison to discuss her conflicted feelings about Volkov's continued cooperation. "Sarah, I'm struggling with something. Volkov's intelligence cooperation has been valuable, but I'm not sure I'm comfortable being seen as an advocate for preserving enemy combatants as potential intelligence assets." Sarah, who had become a close friend during their shared ordeal, understood Elena's concerns. "Elena, I think you're overthinking this. Your decision wasn't primarily about intelligence value. It was about choosing mercy in a moment when military policy demanded harshness. The fact that it worked out well doesn't mean you have to endorse a general policy of sparing enemy combatants. But people are using my case to support arguments I'm not sure I agree with. Some are saying we should take more prisoners for intelligence purposes. Others are saying moral courage always trumps military orders. Both of those interpretations miss the complexity of what actually happened. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Elena, you can't control how other people interpret your story. What you can control is how you tell it and what lessons you draw from it. Focus on the principles that guided your decision: human dignity, moral courage, the importance of seeing enemies as human beings, rather than trying to resolve every policy implication. Elena realized that Sarah was right. Her role was not to provide definitive answers to complex policy questions, but to share her experience in a way that helped others think more carefully about moral courage and institutional accountability. A year after beginning her work on ethical training programs, Elena was invited to present her findings to the Army's senior leadership at the Pentagon. The briefing was attended by the Secretary of the Army, the Chief of Staff, and senior generals from major commands around the world. Elena stood before the assembled leadership wearing her uniform with the new ribbons she had earned for her work on training development. She felt the weight of the moment. This was her opportunity to influence military policy at the highest levels. Ladies and gentlemen, over the past year we have developed comprehensive training programs designed to prepare officers for the ethical dilemmas they will face in modern combat operations. These programs are based on real-world scenarios, including cases where good officers have made difficult decisions under extreme pressure. She outlined the key components of the training programs: case study analysis, decision-making frameworks, legal and ethical guidance, and peer discussion sessions. The programs were designed to be integrated into existing professional military education rather than added as separate requirements. The goal of these programs is not to provide simple answers to complex questions, but to give officers the tools they need to think through ethical dilemmas systematically, and to create a culture that supports moral courage when it is needed. During the question and answer session, Elena was asked about the measurable outcomes of ethical training. "Sir, we can measure completion rates, test scores, and participant feedback. But the real measure of success will be whether officers who go through these programs make better decisions when they face moral dilemmas in combat. That's something we may not be able to measure directly, but we believe the investment is worthwhile." The Chief of Staff asked Elena about her personal perspective on the training she was developing. "General, my experience taught me that moral courage is not something that can be trained in a classroom. But we can give officers frameworks for thinking through difficult decisions, and we can create a culture that values moral courage as much as tactical proficiency. Officers who understand that they may face situations where orders and conscience conflict will be better prepared to handle those situations constructively." After the briefing, Elena was approached by several senior officers who shared their own experiences with moral dilemmas in combat. She realized that her case was not unique. Many officers had faced similar situations, though few had been subjected to the same level of scrutiny and punishment. General Morrison pulled Elena aside after the formal session concluded. "Elena, I want you to know that your work over the past year has exceeded our expectations. The training programs you've developed are being adopted not just by the Army, but by the other services as well. Your influence on military ethics training will extend far beyond your individual case." That evening, Elena sat in her Arlington apartment, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. 2 years earlier, she had been a respected combat officer with a promising career. Her decision to spare Dmitri Volkov had led to her disgrace, imprisonment, and eventual vindication. Now she was influencing military policy at the highest levels, working to ensure that other officers would be better prepared for the moral complexities of modern warfare. Her phone rang. The caller was Marcus Chun, her old West Point classmate, who had offered her a civilian position. Elena, I saw the news coverage of your Pentagon briefing. Congratulations, it sounds like your training programs are being very well received. Thanks, Marcus. It's been a challenging but rewarding year. Listen, I'm calling because our company has been asked to bid on implementing ethical training programs for allied militaries. The Pentagon wants to share your curriculum with NATO partners and other allies. Would you be interested in consulting on that project? Elena considered the offer. Working with international partners would extend the impact of her programs beyond the U.S. military and give her exposure to different approaches to military ethics and decision-making. Marcus, I'm interested, but I'd need to get approval from my chain of command. This work has become too important to risk by creating conflicts of interest. Of course. Talk to your leadership and let me know. This could be an opportunity to influence military ethics training on a global scale. The conversation reminded Elena that her work was attracting attention beyond the U.S. military. She had received inquiries from foreign military academies, international organizations, and academic institutions interested in her approach to ethics training. Elena realized that she had found her calling in the aftermath of her personal crisis. Her experience with moral courage and military injustice had prepared her for a role she never could have imagined, helping to reform the very institutions that had failed her. But she also understood that this work would be a lifetime commitment. Military culture changed slowly, and sustainable reform required persistent effort over many years. She was no longer just Elena Vasquez, the officer who had been court-martialed for mercy. She was Elena Vasquez, the advocate for moral courage in military institutions. 6 months later, Elena stood once again in a Syrian school, not the abandoned building where her ordeal had begun, but a functioning school in a liberated area where she was observing the implementation of her ethical training programs with a U.S. Army unit deployed to the region. She watched as young officers worked through scenario-based exercises, discussing moral dilemmas and decision-making frameworks with the kind of analytical rigor that had been missing from her own preparation for combat leadership. "Ma'am," one of the lieutenants approached her during a break in the training. "I wanted to thank you for developing these programs. We've heard about your case, and knowing that the Army is taking these issues seriously makes us feel more confident about handling difficult situations." Elena smiled, remembering her own uncertainty as a young officer facing moral complexities for which she felt unprepared. "Lieutenant, the goal isn't to make these decisions easy. They'll never be easy. The goal is to help you think through them systematically and to know that you're not alone when you face them." As Elena prepared to leave Syria and return to her work in Washington, she received a final message from an unexpected source. Sarah Morrison had forwarded her an email from Jennifer Morrison's former roommate at Fort Bragg, a lieutenant who had recently completed Elena's ethics training program. "Ms. Vasquez, I wanted you to know that your training program helped me through a difficult situation last month. When faced with orders that conflicted with my moral judgment, I used the decision-making framework you developed to work through the issue systematically. I was able to find a solution that honored both military discipline and my personal values. Jennifer Morrison was my friend and roommate, and I know she would be proud of the work you're doing. Your decision to show mercy in Syria has led to programs that are helping officers like me navigate moral complexity with confidence and integrity. Thank you for turning your personal ordeal into something that helps others. Very respectfully, Lieutenant Amanda Foster." Elena closed her laptop and looked out the window of the transport aircraft carrying her home from Syria. The landscape below was marked by years of conflict, but also by signs of reconstruction and hope. She thought about Dmitri Volkov, whose cooperation continued to prevent terrorist attacks. She thought about Jennifer Morrison, whose death had been used to justify Elena's punishment, but whose sister had fought for Elena's vindication. She thought about the thousands of young officers who would benefit from the training programs that had emerged from her experience. Elena's journey from disgrace to redemption was complete, but her mission was just beginning. She had learned that moral courage was not a single moment of decision, but a lifetime commitment to doing the right thing, even when it was difficult and costly. As the aircraft flew toward Washington and her continued work on military ethics reform, Elena felt at peace with the choices that had brought her to this point. She had been court-martialed for mercy, but that mercy had ultimately led to programs that would help countless others find the courage to choose compassion over convenience, principle over expediency, and human dignity over institutional conformity. Questions she had faced in that Syrian school, whether to show mercy or follow orders, had been answered not just by her individual choice, but by the work that choice had inspired. Elena Vasquez had found her life's purpose in the space between military discipline and moral courage, and she would spend the rest of her career helping others navigate that same complex terrain. Her story had become larger than her individual experience, transformed into a symbol of the importance of moral courage in military institutions and the possibility of redemption through service to others. Elena had been court-martialed for mercy, but that mercy had ultimately transformed both her life and the institution she served. 5 years after her vindication, Elena stood at the podium of the International Conference on Military Ethics in Geneva, Switzerland. As the keynote speaker, she addressed an audience of military leaders, ethicists, and policymakers from 43 nations. Her hair showed the first traces of silver, and her bearing carried the quiet confidence of someone who had survived institutional failure and emerged stronger. Moral courage, she told the assembled delegates, is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. It is not the luxury of those in comfortable positions, but the necessity of those who understand that some principles transcend personal cost. Behind her, a presentation slide showed statistics from the past 5 years, hundreds of military officers who had completed her ethics training programs, dozens of cases where those officers had successfully navigated moral dilemmas without facing the institutional punishment that had nearly destroyed Elena's life, and measurable improvements in military decision-making across multiple conflicts. The young soldier I chose to spare in that Syrian school taught me that mercy and military effectiveness are not opposing forces. They are complementary aspects of honorable service. Today, because of programs developed from that single moment of decision, thousands of military leaders are better equipped to face the moral complexities of modern warfare. Elena's final words to the international audience carried the weight of her entire journey. We must never forget that behind every uniform is a human being capable of both courage and compassion. Our institutions must nurture both qualities if we hope to build a more just and peaceful world. As applause filled the hall, Elena reflected on the path that had brought her here, from a moment of mercy in a war zone to a platform for global military reform. Her prisoner had indeed revealed attack plans, but more importantly, her decision had revealed the need for systemic change in how military institutions handle moral courage. The court-martial that was meant to end her career had instead given her life its greatest purpose. Thank you for joining me on this extraordinary 50,000-word journey of courage, redemption, and the power of moral conviction. Creating stories of this depth and complexity is a labor of love that requires extensive research, careful character development, and meticulous attention to every narrative detail. Elena's story reminds us that sometimes our greatest failures become the foundation for our most important contributions. If this epic tale has inspired you, moved you, or kept you engaged through every twist and turn, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. Share this story with friends who appreciate masterful storytelling and complex characters. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest long-form narratives. Your support enables us to continue creating these detailed, immersive stories that explore the depths of human experience. Until our next incredible adventure together, thank you for being part of our storytelling family.